feeling strong, feeling great. DHA helps you elevate.
Hello, I'm Bassam, Hallak from New Mega Ingredients, and welcome to The Good Oil, our podcast series dedicated to exploring the impactful role of DHA in nutrition and well-being. In this first series, we will dive deep into how DHA and omega-3 influence athletic performance, recovery, and overall well-being for athletes and active individuals. Together, we will unpack the latest research, innovations, and practical applications of DHA in sports science. Our goal is to educate and raise awareness about this essential nutrient, providing you with insights that can enhance your training and performance. Whether you're an athlete, a coach, or simply passionate about sports nutrition, there is something here for you. Join us as we embark on this exciting journey to unlock the power of DHA and elevate your understanding of sports nutrition.
Rise and shine, it's game day. Gonna give it all, come what may. Fueling up with the best in mind. DHA's the secret that you'll find.
Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Greg Peoples, a leading expert in the field of omega-3 or DHA and sports science. Greg, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Bassam. It's really quite a enjoyable opportunity to have and a great collaboration we put together.
I was thinking about this morning that what's really interesting, I've actually been with New Mega now for 10 years, in the omega-3 industry for 10 years, but your association with New Mega and omega-3 goes way beyond that, right?
Oh, look, this is starting to show our age, isn't it? I was very fortunate. After I finished undergrad medical science, I was given an opportunity to work with Professor Peter McLennan. Prof. McLennan had been working on omega-3 since the 1980s, in fact, and we'll probably talk about a lot of his work specifically related to heart function and how important it is in terms of protecting against cardiovascular disease. So Peter set me a mission during my honours year. We were using a New Mega high DHA oil, a rich DHA oil, and he said, "Look, I wonder how this would work if we were to give this to elite cyclists. Could it help support their heart function during really
Yeah.
strenuous exercise?" That's where it started for me, and we'll talk about that study as we go through. But from there, he obviously captured my fascination with omega-3, and I went on to also study a PhD under his tutorship. I'd moved from cardiac function more to skeletal muscle function during the PhD, which is another really fascinating story because we now know how important it is for multiple body organs. Heart
Yeah.
and muscle are the two primary ones. And so 2 decades later, probably 80% of my omega-3 studies have involved high DHA rich oil through collaborations, industry-based collaborations with New Mega, and that's through work at the University of Wollongong. And so it's been a great journey. It's been a fascinating journey. What's interesting is that after 2 decades, there's so many questions that we've still got to answer. So I think this is going to see out my career.
Yeah, and the industry collaboration is critical, right? I mean, it's really the commercial side and the science sides coming together, trying to execute what you're going to tell the market to use or what the athlete should use and so forth. I think is critical, right?
Yeah, exactly. And look, from the university perspective, we very much in debt to industry to be able to provide the focus that they have and the outcomes that they have in industry, companies like New Mega, and then also that support. So we can answer those really basic
Yeah.
medical science, exercise physiology questions, as well as put it in perspective of how the industry see that is important, because ultimately we're solving problems for everyday people, aren't we?
Correct.
Whether it's someone who's trying to stay physically active and healthy, or elite athletes, like we'll
Yeah.
talk about in some of these conversations today.
Well, let's get started. And I think I want to start with the basics because some of our audience are probably thinking, what is omega-3 and what's DHA? And, at the end of the day, these omega-3s are what we call polyunsaturated fatty acids, or in the industry, we refer them as PUFAs. So let's start with the basics. What are long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFAs, and how are EPA and DHA unique compared to other fatty acids?
Yeah, that's right. So when we take in all of the components of our diet, obviously it's made up of carbohydrates, proteins, and then fats. Now, depending on who we're talking about, fats can make up a fairly decent proportion of that. So it may be 30 or 40%. But even if we then look within the fats that we take in, we've got major classes, don't we? So we have saturated fatty acids, monounsaturated fatty acids, and now polyunsaturated fatty acids. So our omega-3s fit into those polyunsaturated fatty acids. We also have to remember they're not the only ones. The omega-6s, which are really important as well for human health, also form part of that story. So EPA and DHA are the two longer chain polyunsaturated fatty acids that fit into the omega-3 class. On the other side, we see omega-6 and arachidonic acid, AA, is a really good example of that. And so what's unique about those is the chemical structure, isn't it? So if we look at the fatty acid structure, it can be very short chain, maybe only a few carbons long, or it can be really long. So there can be lots of carbons all strung together. And so when those carbons are strung together, we can be talking about in human health somewhere around sort of 10 or 12, all the way out to 22. And that's where our DHA sits. And then we talk about whether or not they're saturated and unsaturated. So our omega-3s are important because they contain double bonds. And part of that is the location of the double bond is, and that's why it's called an omega-3, 3 carbons in. And so that forms a really critical part of why the chemical structure then plays out into human physiology when we take that into the body through normal nutrition.
Yeah. And, we talk about omega-3s and there's a lot of discussions around ALA. Is there any evidence that increasing the amount of ALA in a diet for improving the overall content of omega-3 acids in the body is, specifically ALA, because we're starting to see a lot of that in the marketplace, but can you talk us through that?
Yeah, look, both in the research area and as you say, the market area, it's a really good conversation to have because although EPA and DHA are the two preformed omega-3s that we emphasize for human health, ALA is also an omega-3 fatty acid. Now, that's a little bit shorter. It's not a pure short chain fatty acid.
Yeah.
It's got 18 carbons in it. And in fact, if we look at ALA from the perspective of intake, it's an essential fatty acid, just like we know the importance of EPA and DHA. We also know that when we take ALA into the diet, that goes into the circulation and it has the opportunity to, as part of the chemical pathway, actually sort of convert into EPA. And this is where the conversation gets really interesting because we've got a couple of different, let's say, thought patterns on how that conversion works and how efficient it is. And what we know is the efficiency, there is an enzyme that allows that to occur, and there's a pathway, theoretical pathway, that ALA can convert into a longer chain omega-3 fatty acid, but the efficiency is pretty poor. So in other words, even when you manipulate the background of omega-6 or other fatty acids that potentially could compete or slow that enzyme down, the enzyme doesn't seem to create any more efficient process or moving ALA through to EPA. And so in other words, what's important is that we consume ALA, but we also need to consume EPA and DHA. We
Yeah.
can't just rely on the body to be able to convert ALA through to EPA and DHA.
What's the conversion rate?
It's around about 5%,
That's pretty
10% at
low.
the most. Yeah, it's pretty low.
Yeah.
Now, how do we know this? What's interesting, it's really difficult to do studies with humans on this topic because obviously we've got so many different fatty acids coming in, and to be able to control the background diet is really difficult. So and I referred to Prof. McLennan before. He had been working on this topic for a long time. And so to do this, you've actually got to conduct animal studies. And that's what we've done at the University of Wollongong, where you can manipulate the background diet of your animal's diet. And then you can have a look at presenting ALA, EPA, and DHA with high omega-6, low omega-6, high omega-3, low omega-3 total content. And what's really interesting is that you do need to consume the EPA and DHA for it to eventually incorporate into the body, and you just simply can't rely on ALA to be progressed through its natural biochemistry, let's say.
And it's interesting that you mentioned about the omega-6 and omega-3. Clearly, the evolution of the human diet's changed. So how about the adjustment of the balance between omega-6 and omega-3? Where is it today and where does it need to be and how do you do it?
Yeah, it's really good that you refer to that evolution of the human diet because industrialization has certainly seen a change in the profile of that total fat that we take in. And certainly we know that there is, for an average human Western style diet, there's an increased amount of saturated fat that's coming through the diet. But we also know that over time, we're talking over more than a century, there's been a reduction in the amount of total omega-3s that are taken in, and there's been an increase in the amount of total
Yeah.
omega-6s that are taken in. And so the question then lies is it the ratio or the balance? And that, as soon as you start talking about that, it informs that there's some form of competition between omega-6 and omega-3. And what we do know is omega-6 is actually really important for our diet as well. It's just that we've kind of tipped the
Mm.
scales a little bit too far in that side of the two major classes of PUFAs that we're talking about. So the question then is, do I have to reduce my omega-6s, or can I reduce my omega-6s and then simply the EPA and the DHA will resolve itself? Or do I need to take EPA and DHA in? And it's actually the latter. And again, I refer back to our animal studies where we were able to manipulate the background of all of these fats. And what fell out as being really important is that you have to present preformed EPA and DHA.
Yeah.
It's not just simply about manipulating the balance. Now, there's still some very good reason why you could potentially reduce your omega-6s because, again, the Western style diet, we're probably consuming a little bit too much than what we need. Again, I'd like to emphasize omega-6 has still got an important role, but we could probably, just like saturated fat and trans fats, we could probably refer to bringing those down. But what's most important is that we need to present EPA and DHA. We know the Western style diet does not actually take
Is there a
enough.
right ratio? I mean, in a diet, I mean, is it 1 to 4 to omega-3?
Yeah. Now this is an interesting controversial area. So from our perspective and the lab that I've worked in under Prof. McLennan and now taken over from, we don't refer to a ratio because we believe it's actually the presentation in the diet of EPA and DHA that's most important. As I
Yeah.
said before, that there's some good reason why you should be able to bring down your omega-6s, but it's not that the omega-6s are doing anything to block the omega-3s.
Yeah.
We're just not taking enough in. I have to acknowledge that there is obviously others and other labs that have referred to this ratio, that there is a potential ultimate ratio between the two. And that's true, but the ratio shouldn't be a reason for actually then sort of manipulating the amount of EPA and DHA based on the ratio per se. It's the presentation that's most important of those two preformed EPA and DHA fatty acids.
Yeah. I want to turn to the omega-3 status, right? And how do you quantify an athlete's omega-3 status, and why is the omega-3 index, which we talk about a lot in the industry, and science and practitioners are talking about now. So why is the omega-3 index such an important biomarker to quantify the omega-3?
Yeah. So if we define the omega-3 index, we're using the red blood cell. And it gets us into now a conversation around the importance of long-term protracted intake of EPA and DHA. So when we look at the red blood cell, it's obviously got a membrane like every other cell in our body. But what's really interesting is obviously the red blood cells turn over every 120 days or so. And so they're in constant flux. And that membrane then is a reflection of our long-term profile of fat that we take in. And so, if I'd like to just go back in history a little bit, prior to the omega-3 index, and prior to Bill Harris coming up with the omega-3 index, and what's been really the breakthrough is a finger prick blood sample that enables us to do that now. When I was a young student in the lab, we would take a venous blood sample and we would separate the blood into the red blood cells and the plasma and the white blood cells, and then we'd take the red blood cells and we'd actually break them up, and we'd take what we call now phospholipids. And the phospholipids are those fatty acids that are sitting inside the membrane that are reflecting our diet in the long term, and we would then measure of those phospholipids how much omega-3, how much omega-6, saturated fat, and so on. And we were always doing that. Now, what's really interesting is that red blood cell is kind of like it's a biomarker for the other cells in our body. So if we have a look at a muscle cell or a heart cell or a brain cell, when our red blood cells change because we change our diet, we can also then infer that our other cells are changing alongside that. What's tricky is, how do you get a muscle cell sample out of an athlete or any person? How do you get a heart cell? You can't. So the biomarker forms a really nice, non-invasive way of either quantifying the omega-3 status of someone, or indeed, after they've made some changes to their diet, they can then actually see what the impact of that change is. So if they start to present EPA and DHA, omega-3 fatty acids, the red blood cell will start to tell that story.
Yeah.
Now, what's really fascinating is that because it's a finger prick blood sample, that is now making it available to
Yeah.
everybody in the community.
And in our industry, there's a few companies that actually provide those kits, and they're readily available now. How about the DHA, EPA in terms of the inflammation ratio?
Mhm.
We talk about athletes training or competing, and then there's that recovery stage, which is
Mm.
about controlling inflammation. Could you talk us through that?
Part of doing an omega-3 status profile is one, we can identify the omega-3 index. So that is the sum of EPA and DHA
Yep.
together. And that we've got some really good scales that we can talk about in terms of where they sit. And the other is that we can look at a ratio of arachidonic acid, which was the omega-6 that we talked about before, to EPA, so eicosapentaenoic acid. So what we're doing in that instance is we're looking at from the two major pathways that break down into our thromboxanes, our leukotrienes, prostaglandins. We've now got the two major fatty acids that are producing the two arms. So on one side, we have arachidonic acid being an omega-6 breaking down into their inflammatory derivatives. And then on the other side, we have EPA breaking down into the eicosanoid side, and we can look at some of the anti-inflammatory properties. Now, again, it's a really important topic that inflammation is actually an important part of human health. It's actually an important part of physical training. We actually need to create inflammation to create training stress.
Yeah.
What's important is that inflammation doesn't run out of control. And so if we then take that finger prick blood sample we talked before and we look at the ratio between omega-6, arachidonic acid, omega-3, EPA, we can start to then look at what is the combination of those two fatty acids that are contributing to the pro-inflammatory and the anti-inflammatory side of human health, and then training if you're an athlete.
I suppose now, when you look at athletes and the general population, is there any evidence that athletes consume more EPA and DHA compared to the general population? And I'm particularly keen for you to share some insights from your studies, particularly your findings around the study you did with the Astana, pro cycling team, the NCAA college football athletes, or the rugby league athletes here in Australia. Could you maybe share some insights around that?
Yeah, so again, we've used the finger prick blood sample in all three accounts. So there's three really different types of athletes there. So you got your
Can I just ask you,
yeah.
how many athletes were in total?
So the pro cycling team had a squad of, off the top of my head, it was about 25 European-based cyclists. The NCAA football team that we had access to had around about 50 at our baseline sample. And then the rugby league was actually a women's female rugby league team here in Australia. And again, it had a squad of about 25. So we're talking about close to 100 athletes in this instance. But I can also talk about sort of, we're not the only group that are looking at omega-3 status of athletes across the globe. But in terms of those three, if we go back to the omega-3 index, one thing that we haven't talked about is what type of scale can we refer to that? And then we can talk about these athletes and where do they sit. So with the omega-3 index, if we add up the percentage of EPA and DHA, and this is Bill Harris's scale that he developed, this is going on 2 decades ago now, if you're less than 4%, we would say that you've got suboptimal intake. And what's interesting is if you look at the population, it sits somewhere in the 4s to 5s. If you're between 4% and 8%, you potentially are starting to take in some level of EPA and DHA, but it's not enough. So we still refer to that as suboptimal. If it's over 8%, we're now seeing some really good intake of EPA and DHA, and that percent of 8% is highly correlated to particularly cardiovascular health. So that scale is a cardiovascular scale. But if we go back to the athletes, we can use the scale independent of cardiovascular disease to actually just sort of place them on how many milligrams of EPA and DHA do we think they're taking in. So again, it's an important point to remember is that if you do the classic dietary records and you ask someone, what did you eat this week? What did you eat last week? What did you eat today?
Yeah.
One, they might not remember.
Yeah.
And two, they're probably a little bit inaccurate. So what the blood sample does is provide us with an opportunity to sort of break away from the idea that people aren't good at self-reporting and actually say what is actually presented in the bloodstream over the last couple of months through their diet. So if we just go back to those athletes again, long story,
Yeah.
what we noticed is our American group were one of the lowest
Yeah.
omega-3 status group. So they were down in the mid to low 4% omega-3 index. Our female rugby league players in Australia, they were a little bit higher. They were averaging around 5%. Still not great,
Still
a
low.
little bit higher. The Astana Pro Cycling Team, this was interesting. This is the highest group we've ever observed. On average, they are around 7%. So
Oh,
on
wow.
average, they're getting close to that 8% optimal cardiovascular protective scale that we talk about. Now, there's a couple of reasons why. Of a squad of about 24 riders, and they're all male in this group, we had approximately 4 or 5 of them that were already between 9 and 10%.
Oh, wow.
They were really high. And so that's just a combination of not only a supplement, but they're also eating good intake of marine-based
Okay.
foods. We had a group that sat sort of around, the majority of the group sat between sort of 6 and 7. And then we had a few, about 4 or 5 riders that are down at the more classic sort of 4 to 5 you see in Western diet. So of all the studies that are actually out there, the Astana group that we published is the highest group on average without we didn't intervene. We just turned up and said, we'll take your blood
Blood
sample.
samples, yeah.
They are the highest group that we've actually seen in the literature so far. And it's probably a really good example of athletes that are very particular about their diet. They work closely with sports nutritionists and they are not leaving any stone unturned.
Yeah.
And the quality of their diet is quite high. So that revolves back. If you look at the 4 or 5 athletes that were at top, they were eating very um, determinate Mediterranean style diet. And in fact, if you look at the cultural background of a few of those cyclists, they were from Spain, for example.
Yeah.
And so fish and marine based products are actually sort of a really important part of just their
Correct.
normal diet in that instance.
Yeah, correct. You've just sort of highlighted to us the importance of omega-3 for athletes. Keen to understand in terms of the sustaining the omega-3 status, once it's there. Can athletes maintain an optimal omega-3 status or a high omega-3 index despite the intense training, competition schedules? How did the Astana Pro Cycling team manage this during the Grand Tours, for example?
Yeah, so that was the second part of the study. We not only looked to say what was the omega-3 index and their baseline status, we said, is there an opportunity over the course of the Grand Tours to look to see whether or not, when they were then given some further advice, particularly the cyclists that were at the bottom, so they obviously needed more attention than the 4 or 5 that were already consuming fish, would there be an opportunity that they could also increase their omega-3 status, their omega-3 index over the course of the season? Now, the basis to this, I guess, hypothesis or question, if you take an endurance athlete like a Tour de France cyclist that are having to ride in excess of 250 days a year,
Yeah.
obviously fatty acids play a really important role in terms of being able to supply the energy demands. And so when we take fat in, it's obviously not just about our membranes, it's about being stored for fuel, for example, and that storage can include intramuscular triglycerides. But we also know that those endurance-based athletes are making a lot of energy out of fat. So the idea then is, well, would there be some preference to certain fatty acids being used for fuel? And does the body still see the EPA and the DHA as specialized fats that, when presented, would then be incorporated preferentially, is what we say, into the membranes of those really critical cells like brain and heart and red blood cell and epithelial tissue within the vascular system? So what we did, this was a bit of a kind of a field study. It's not a traditional lab study. Obviously, some of the cyclists were already optimized. Some of the cyclists needed a little bit more attention. There was 4 at the bottom, 4 or 5 at the bottom that needed a lot more attention. So working with their sports dietitian, they got some individual kind of prescription in a way to sort of say, look, you should be taking some more omega-3 supplement, plus also look at some marine-based sources. You guys at the top seem to be doing all right, continue as usual. So we then came back at the end of the season and we then did a really brief survey with them, but we also looked at their omega-3 status after we'd nearly given them an education process. And what was interesting is that the 2 outcomes was that we answered the question, yes, you can go through both a grand tour and multiple grand tours and maintain a high omega-3 index as long as the presentation of that preformed EPA and DHA was
Yeah.
still there.
Yeah.
But to the cyclists that were more successful, were those that were a little bit more attentive to it. So where we said you should be doing this daily, the ones that didn't seem to have the extensive change in omega-3 index or less change in omega-3 index, they were a little bit more ad hoc. They may have been doing it every several days. And so really that gave us a really good clue to the consistency is really important. Uh, but it is achievable. You can maintain a high omega-3 index and be a Tour de France cyclist at the same time.
Yeah. And just in terms of, I think you touched on this, the cell membrane incorporation. What is the fundamental difference between the presence of circulating fatty acids and their incorporation in a cell membranes? How do you dose and in terms of duration impact in the process?
This has been a central pillar to our laboratory work, and that's the idea that incorporation of these fatty acids into the membranes is where the physiological benefits lie. So let's just go back to, we have a meal, there's fat involved in that meal. We then take that fat and we put it into circulation. That fat's got lots of different roles, doesn't it? It's part of the LDL, HDL cholesterol story. It's part of the substrates I talked about before, intramuscular triglyceride, but it's also part of the membranes. So when we take in fat, we obviously get a surge in the presentation of free fatty acids and triglycerides moving around the body, and that will start to dissipate. What we know is that the presentation of EPA and DHA, particularly to heart, to muscle, to brain over a prolonged period of time, means that those phospholipids, and we're tracking those using the red blood cell, aren't we, with the omega-3
Yeah,
index,
yeah,
those membranes start to, we could refer to them remodel. So in other words, the the relative proportion of EPA and DHA starts to increase inside that bilipid layer. So every cell has a bilipid layer, and every bilipid layer has these little fatty acid tails. So we can start to put more DHA and EPA into the membranes. So what we should be thinking about is that the long-term consistent intake is about remodeling the
yeah.
membranes as opposed to just a circulating effect. And if we can just tell a small anecdotal story, is that often when we work alongside, say, a team like Astana, is that the initial response is that, well, I'll take the omega-3 straight after training for its anti-inflammatory effect, which is, on a principle level, you think, okay, that's all right. Okay, the omega-3 goes in the bloodstream, it's available. But the point is, it hasn't had time to incorporate into the membrane. So it's actually really critical that you prepare for those inflammatory responses as opposed to try and put a band-aid
So
over
you
the
want to
top.
have it in your system before you do the training, before you go and compete, and before the recovery
That's right.
process.
So don't see it as something like you're taking it afterwards.
Yep.
You're actually preparing your body for it. And that's where we start to then get into how long, how much is really
Yeah.
important for that.
So then that comes down to, okay, well, what is your practical advice for athlete based on your research? What are your advice you would give to not just athletes? There are, we tend to talk about athletes, but there's a lot of people who are becoming more active, which is really important. What's your advice for them in terms of looking to optimize that omega-3 intake for enhanced performance and also, more important, recovery? And as you know now, recovery is just as important as the training, because if you recover, you
Exactly.
train well. If you train well, you then compete well.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a couple of really key themes that we've learnt over the last 2 decades. Is if we strip it back, the average person is not taking in enough EPA and
Yeah.
DHA. So let's call it around 150 to 200 milligrams on average. I'm probably being fairly generous, and that results in omega-3 index probably around 4 or 5% at best. Again, being fairly
Yeah.
generous. And so what we know is that with a low omega-3 status to start with and a low intake, even presenting around about another 500 milligrams of a combined EPA and DHA, without getting into the specifics of which one at the moment, just adding another 500 milligrams actually has a fairly decent effect. And so what we know, it's a little bit like getting off the couch if you've been sedentary. Some of the biggest effects are seen in those early stages. Same with omega-3, going from 150 to 200 milligrams up to 500 can actually make a decent difference in
Yeah.
the average person. What we want to know is that from that 500 milligrams total, what would athletes actually need? And so if we go back to those studies, we've started to refer and move around that 1,000 milligrams. And we'll talk about different doses in later podcasts for different studies that have used, and they can extend into their thousands. But I like to keep three numbers in mind. The average person in the population's around about 150 to 200. We're trying to hit 500 minimum.
Mm.
For athletes, it looks like 1,000 in combined EPA and DHA, and we can manipulate that later, but at least 1,000 is actually good for the long term in terms of being able to prepare the body from a membrane point of view.
Mm.
In terms of uptake, do I take it the day before or do I take it 10? We know it does take weeks. Okay. And so if we go to our lab studies, we always run lab studies around about 8 to 12 weeks because that's where we start to see for any given dose the omega-3 index start to hit its plateau. Now, what's interesting is if I compare 500 to 1,000, the plateau of omega-3 index will probably be a little bit higher with 1,000
Yeah.
compared to 500, but both of them will eventually, over time, reach that sort of 8% uh, threshold that we talk about in terms of cardiac protection.
Can you have too much omega-3?
There's safety recommendations that are provided, and the number that's often provided there is 5,000 milligrams per day. And so you actually see a lot of research
Which is a
studies.
lot.
Yeah, it's a lot, and it's a point that
Yeah.
I want to make during this series is that a lot of studies operate around the 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 milligrams.
Yeah.
It's not dietary translatable, is it? You know, you're talking therapeutic supplemental intake, massive amounts at that
Yeah.
stage over a long term. The question is, do I need 2,000, 3,000, 4,000? We certainly know if you start from a low omega-3 index, if you give yourself a higher dose, you'll probably start to increase your omega-3 index a bit quicker. It's still going to take weeks, but it's probably going to get there a little bit faster. In terms of sustained dose, though, that 500 milligrams to 1,000 milligrams seems to be the magic number in the long term. Now, if you boil that back, if you take your 500 milligrams, it's starting to look like 2 fatty fish meals per week, isn't it?
Yeah.
And if you then look at the population-based data and the evidence in the cardiovascular literature, the 2 fatty fish meals per week come out as, for example, cardioprotective. So it's not by chance that we can make good inroads to improving our omega-3 index by literally getting ourselves to 500 to start with, and then having a look at what is the specific needs of my body and should I be actually moving up to around about 1,000 in the long term.
Yep.
Now and then you could actually argue, for example, if you've only got 2 or 3 weeks to the start of the season, maybe 2,000 is warranted. But it doesn't mean that I've got to take 2,000 every day of the week. It might mean that after several weeks of 2,000, I can pull myself back down onto 1,000, and that's a nice maintenance dose. So if I go back to the Astana study, it was around about 1,000 that we were looking at, and they were able to sustain that over 3 grand tours.
Yeah, and I think 1,000 milligrams or a gram of DHA EPA is actually not that difficult, especially with supplementation, right?
That's right, and I think that's actually a really good point, that it's looking at all of the options for intake. So it's a combination of saying, well, recognizing where food can provide an extra 100 milligrams or 150 milligrams, and then looking to those supplemental options that are also available to us to be able to top up on top of the food, because it's actually a really critical element to this, isn't it? That we do have food chain available sources for EPA and DHA. That's really critical. So it's not that we have access to them every day or we choose to eat them every day. So it's this combination of being aware of your foods and what it's providing you, and then being able to balance that off with supplemental intake when needed.
Just in terms of obviously you've done a lot of research up till now, the last 20 years. In terms of future research direction, what are some of the key areas, where you believe future research should focus to better understand and optimize the omega-3 status in athletes or active people?
So, I mean, working in collaboration with Numega on particular occasions over the last 2 decades, our focus in our lab has been about DHA. So we have a pretty strong hypothesis around the importance of DHA, skeletal muscle, heart, and now brain. If I look at the broader literature, there hasn't been such a differentiation. So it's been about supplementing omega-3, providing a fish oil. And so what we've actually lacked in the last 2 decades is more groups actually focusing on the difference between DHA and EPA. And again, I referred to the fact that we've been very DHA specific in the lab because I studied with Prof. McLennan, and Prof. McLennan had a very strong hypothesis about the role of DHA for heart function. And so then it was logical that using a DHA-rich oil like the Numega oil was a very good way of answering that question. But I would like to see more studies that actually set hypothesis based on DHA and more studies that set hypothesis based on EPA, because we know that everybody's not taking enough of
Yeah.
either of those two fatty acids, and they're both quite critical at the end of the
Yeah.
day. So I'd like to see more work done in actually trying to differentiate the two. We're starting to see a few studies appear, and we can talk about those as we go through. But that's actually where I would see a lot more extended understanding about the specific natural roles of those two with
Yep.
physical activity.
Yep. All right. Well, I mean, before we sort of wrap up this first podcast, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners about DHA, omega-3s, or your ongoing research?
Yeah. So look, I think what's we haven't touched on is the idea that those two fatty acids do have some preferential incorporation into different cells across the body. And so from a physical activity point of view and supporting cells that we use to play sport, undergo physical activity, we know that DHA is really important in terms of skeletal muscle, cardiac, and now brain as well. And so I think what's really critical, and it gets to the idea of splitting up the two roles, is that when we do look at outcomes that are related to muscle, that we actually consider that, is it the DHA that we've actually made a change in? If it's heart and heart rate, for example, is it the DHA that we've made a change in that person's diet? And if not, maybe we're actually digging down the wrong rabbit hole. And so it's really critical that studies going forward actually understand what is the hypothesis that we're setting, and therefore what fatty acids should we be focusing on in this instance.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Greg, for sharing. I mean, it's been an insightful sort of first session for us. And thank you for tuning in to The Good Oil. Stay tuned for more episodes where we dive deeper into the DHA science behind sports and performance. In our next episode of The Good Oil, we're diving into some fascinating research that highlights the crucial role of DHA in enhancing sports performances and what does the latest science say about DHA, athletes and their training outcomes.
DHA, the athlete's choice. Heart and brain, let's raise our voice. Muscle recovery will go far. With omega-3, your shining star.